Good afternoon. I am Barend Erasmus, the Dean of the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Pretoria. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this first installation of Conversations at NAS for 2022. Conversations at NAS is an initiative that we started last year as a platform where experts, civil society, industry, and whoever else is an expert can join in conversations that matter. We provide thought leadership, we provide ideas, we kick around some ideas, and we debate the matters of the day. For today, we've got a particularly interesting topic, and for that reason, we're actually partnering with one of our fellow faculties here at the University of Pretoria. We're partnering with the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and in particular, Professor Natasha Holzhausen, the Director for the Center for the Future World of Work. We also have partners from Agri-Gauteng, but I'll leave it to Natasha to do the introductions. The reason why we're partnering is that today's topic is a cross-cutting one. We are dealing with not just agricultural matters, but we're also dealing with the future of work. What will agricultural careers look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how does that affect higher education? When we talk about agricultural opportunities, in particular, I want to emphasize that we're dealing with the entire agricultural value chain. So everything from soils, soil science, soil chemistry, even the microbiome inside the soil, soil preparation, horticulture, agriculture, tilling practices, conservation agricultural practices, nowadays also called regenerative agriculture, all the way to how we produce the food, how we process the food, how we transport, the logistics, all the way to the retail sector, where consumer science and consumer choice is coming to play. So we're dealing with a whole gamut all the way from the soil, all the way through to the actual retail stores. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Natasha Holzhausen, and she will lead the panel discussion from here onwards. Natasha, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very interesting conversation series. And we are delighted that it is a collaborative effort between the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, specifically the Center for the Future of Work, as well as this particular faculty. Now, we are very fortunate here to have experts, and also we have an expert that is joining us virtually because in part that is also what will be the future of work, and we are quite familiar with that. And the question that we need to ask is that how do we, within the fourth industrial revolution, we prefer to refer to society 5.0, how do we create smart societies that can function within this constantly changing world that we are in? And whether we like it or not, it's here already. So we have a panel that will discuss what they foresee, and it is really a wonderful mix of panelists that we have. So firstly, let me introduce Professor J.B. Dudu. He is the HOD of Consumer and Food Sciences. Then we also, virtually, we have Professor Cheryl Hendricks. She is the HOD of Agricultural Economics, Extension and Rural Development. And then also, I'm really happy to welcome Ms. Ayanda Nchangazi, who is the head of Communication and Center of Excellence from Agri-Gauteng. So, let's think about this for a moment. And this is a projection that we need to make. So if I'm going to start with the way in which I introduced our panelist. JB, tell me, how would you think, what will the future of work and agriculture look like in, say, for example, 10 years' time? How do you perceive it to be, especially in your area?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I like the reference the Dean made to the value chain. And I think it's useful to visualize this in terms of the value chain. And if you look at the food value chain, and you are thinking about work within the food value chain, you have a very, very broad spectrum of types of work and so on. And in actual fact, what we are doing is that we're training students who will be employed at various points within this value chain. And so because it's a very broad spectrum, it is actually useful to maybe categorize it very simply. One would say, looking at types of work that are maybe more on-farm, types of work that are more off-farm. And I think going forward, one of the things that one would begin to see is that you begin to see creation of more jobs and so on, more off-farm than on-farm. The reason being that countries are developing, economies are developing. This is particularly the case in Africa, where urbanization is taking hold. It's affecting people's choices. There is a desire for convenience in food choices, and that leads to, feeds back to leads to creation of jobs more off-farm than on-farm. But let me add that in the African context, I think there are some nuances. One of them that I'll mention is the fact that if you look at the whole value chain, smallholder farming as well as subsistence farming is very, very important. So if you one has to look at the future of work and not forget that smallholder farming, subsistence farming will continue to be an important part of it. And potentially there are opportunities there for creation of some more specialized types of jobs for the students that we train.
Okay. Interesting there in terms of the whole concept of on-farm and off-farm, and then the many opportunities that it presents to us. Cheryl, what do you think is going to happen in 10 years' time?
Well, we hope the situation will look different to what we face at the moment. We know that rapid advances in science will shape future agricultural production, processing, and also the production of food. So food itself will change. So, for example, biotechnology developments can provide designer crops, designer animals, designer fish, and designer food that may positively or negatively affect the quality and the health promoting components of the food we eat. So, for example, you can have targeted nutrition through particular foods or crops. And we have many ways of dealing with identification and specific targeting of diseases. But such developments may exacerbate inequalities. We know that African agriculture lags behind in terms of science and technology and research and development. And we know that many farmers are still struggling with productivity issues, changing climates, lack of energy, and as JB's mentioned, consumer-driven changes. So we know that digitization is the future, and it will lead to many solutions like microfertilization, disease detection and treatment that's very specific, reducing the amount of fertilizer, pesticides and herbicides, and improving the quality of the food that's produced. We know that digitization can also connect, particularly future food systems will become more integrated, global and connected. And so digitization opens opportunities for the remotest farmers to connect and access prices, market extension and knowledge through the system. So we know that we will have to work in future across artificial intelligence systems, but also in a more team-driven approach as we deal with these integrated systems. So we will still need feet on the ground. So while digitization and mechanization may be seen as a threat to some segments of the agricultural sector, and we're primarily manual labor exists, we know that future food systems will need high-level human skills, particularly with integrated thinking, high-level communication skills, coordination of players in the system, networking, and very strong negotiation skills when we deal with the complexities that we will face in future.
Thank you, Cheryl. I think you are pointing out, a question that is often on many people's minds. So with digitalization, what becomes the role of the human? So you giving us an overview in terms of skills, teamwork, that we would still actually need humans to be involved. That, so it's almost like watching too many sci-fi movies. We're going to have a pill that we pop and there's just going to be robots everywhere. But you are indicating that this is not the case. JB, you also, that there are many opportunities. Yes. Oh. That's great. Thank you. Ayanda, what is your perspective 10 years from now?
Yes. So just to add on to the focus on the entire value chain of agriculture and where we are moving forward in the next 10 or 20 or let's say the next generation.
Yes.
Is also the opportunity within agriculture to export and import in the African continent. It is something we need to look at. It is definitely a point of consideration that can also even change the entire operation of the value chain. And with the ease of technology and digitization, it allows for those channels, for that exporting and importing opportunity to be made even more easier than actually going to the country, but doing business virtually with other countries within the African continent. So not only strengthening our local agricultural market in the value chain, but also the international or even the African continent when it comes to positioning it as the hub of agriculture in the world. So that's something we should also even look at as one of the trends or what the future work of agriculture might look like in the next 10, 15 or the next generation.
So it's also crossing of boundaries.
Yes.
So I always think that it's not the Africa we want, it's the Africa we deserve. And what do we need to do to ensure that we get to the Africa that we deserve? So just before I move on to a question, I am inviting all our guests to please post questions on the YouTube channel. Perhaps you have even a comment. Join the conversation. Also, we are on Twitter, so you can either go via the Economic and Management Sciences Twitter page or specifically at Natural and Agricultural Sciences, and theirs is at NAS, at UP NAS Agric. So UP NAS Agric, and then if we could have a hashtag, use NAS Conversation. So let's become part of this particular conversation that will literally impact each and every one of us. So it's not just in terms of whether there will be farmers or not, it's literally in terms of our food security as well, and what the future holds. So thank you for that. Now, I'm also curious. So, Ayanda, you mentioned Africa. And Africa, obviously, it's close to all our hearts. What do you think, and you mentioned the mega trends, but what do you think would be the mega trends and the disruptions that are currently driving agriculture? So this would relate, could all the panel members, I'm going to ask this of all of you, do you perhaps have particular case studies, say from Africa, given that we are in the continent, that you could share with us? Ayanda, can I start with you this time around?
All right. So when we look at the trends that are disrupting the agricultural industry from an African perspective, is that there is a huge growth when it comes to urbanization. And a lot of our young generations are moving from the rural areas into the urban areas. At the same time, another trend that is also disrupting the agricultural value chain as a whole is the growing population. So our farmers still need to support the growing population in Africa. At the same time, there's also a growth whereby there's a growth in urbanization, where you find your young people moving into the urban areas, or even urbanization of of agricultural areas that used to be agricultural areas back in the day, or agricultural land, which is now used for business production. There are buildings, physical buildings there, and no longer natural crop production happening as it used to be back in the day. So that also plays a major part as to then what happens in the value chain. Does the farmer now, at the end of the day, try to minimize cost, but still provide the quantities that the nation needs to eat? The nation still needs to eat at the end of the day. That doesn't change. We need to eat every single day. Our consumer patterns are changing every single day. So it's very important for our farmers to cater for that. And that's where the disruption of, or the trend of technology comes in, to cut the cost, but still produce the volumes that our country needs at the end of the day. So, that's an example I can think of right now, particularly specifically focusing on Africa.
So going back to that, the value chain in terms of agriculture, and then linking to what Cheryl has said. Cheryl, what examples could you share with us from the African context?
Okay, so for me, the disruptions are quite complex. We hear lots of dialogue in the global debate about the 3 C's: climate, COVID, and conflict. And these are peculiar, not all of them, but the context is peculiar to Africa. I would add consumption trends as one of the C's, but the big 4 F's that come up from the Ukraine war, or the war in Ukraine, is fertilizer, food or fodder, fuel, and finance. And these are going to become far more complex and integrated. And we're going to have to think of very clever solutions. But one of the advantages of South African graduates and students from Africa is the contextual knowledge that we have. For many people, that includes the indigenous knowledge of how things work with nature, and how we can apply those lessons to the specific problems that we face. So one example, let me give you something a little bit off the wall, perhaps, for crop scientists and agriculture. In Mauritius, for example, the octopus population is seriously threatened by undersized catches and by overfishing. So we know octopus is calamari. It's a big trade commodity for Mauritius. They've combined social protection, which is social grants or funding, to communities for periods in which they may not fish. So there's a provision of an incentive not to fish so that the ecology can recover and that the sustainability of the octopus population is there. So to me, this is an example of the kind of future graduates that we need, people who are able to connect across different disciplines to consider the environmental components, the social components, the economic elements of a particular industry at various levels, the national income as well as household level income, and tying all of these elements together. And so for me, that contextual knowledge that perhaps is not always there for fresh graduates is something that will become very, very important in future. Knowing how climate affects the particular context in which somebody is operating, either as an entrepreneur or an employee, is very important for finding future solutions.
I thank you. I really hope that our policymakers are listening to this, because obviously the discussion that we are having does not just impact in terms of our graduates, in terms of the employability of our students, but it has a ripple effect, and it impacts literally on every sector of society. So whether it's private, public, non-for-profit, your on-off farmers. It's literally, as I've said before, got to do with each and every one of us. So in terms of then policy, how do we address aspects relating to, for example, climate? We've seen the devastating effects of COVID, and we know that there is a lot of conflict in the world, and we have already seen how our own prices are going up due to the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. So yes, that is, it's kind of frightening, but it's good to know that we have a faculty on whose doors we could come and knock. That helps. JB, what do you like? What would you like to contribute? From your experiences?
When talking about trends and disruptions, there are quite a number. But I think those also give us opportunities to see things from a different perspective. Because these disruptions, quote and unquote, influence the way we do agriculture. And therefore, that has an effect on the kinds of jobs or work, the types of work that we have in agriculture. And that then informs how we train our students for work in future. You mentioned climate, and that's a very, very important example, major disruption. But then that has driven what we are now calling climate smart agriculture. And there are various examples of how we do climate smart agriculture these days, but I will mention a few examples. From an African perspective, there are, if you take cereals, for instance, there are certain types of cereals that are African in origin, and those types of cereals are known to be drought tolerant, and so on. Sorghum, the millets, and so on. But the reality is that in Africa, maize is also a very, very important food crop. But then when you compare maize as we know it with sorghum, it's not drought tolerant. Okay. So some years ago, there was an initiative which was called the Drought Tolerant Maize Initiative, where through breeding techniques, this was pioneered by this institute called CIMMYT, which is the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, together with IITA, which is the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. So what they did was to use breeding techniques to develop drought-tolerant maize varieties. And the interesting thing is that they released around about, in the region of about 200 new drought-tolerant maize varieties between 2007 and 2015. And these drought-tolerant maize varieties have yields about at least 30% higher than the normal maize that we have. So that's an example of ways by which we can do, quote and unquote, climate smart agriculture. That's just one example. Think about agroforestry. Okay, we have a big agroforestry unit in the university where you are planting crops and trees together in a specific and a designed fashion in order to lead to sustainability and so on. And one could go on and on. There are various other examples, things to do with precision agriculture. We've spoken about digitization. Think about mobile technology, the use of mobile technology by farmers and so on. Now, all of these are giving us opportunities to create jobs in new areas within the value chain. And that then informs how we train our students to feed into the value chain. So I think climate change is a very, very big, quote unquote, disruption, which we can actually leverage for our own good in terms of how we do agriculture and the types of jobs we create in agriculture going forward.
Ayanda?
I'd like to add on to
Yes, please do.
what Professor said now about the climate change and how we can control, I wouldn't say control that, but smart climate management, put it that way. And that also would form part of urban farming, and the new ways of farming, which means they are focused basically on small scale farming, which can also be done in urban areas as well. And that includes your aquaponics, your hydroponics. So in that way, you also, because everything is done inside a structure and inside a contained structure, you're the one who's actually responsible for adjusting the temperature, making sure there's enough water instead of relying on the natural climate to predict your harvest time when you can do it yourself. Through the technology and the tunnel farming and the hydroponic facilities or systems that are available for you to control your own temperature, which at the same way you're combating the ever-changing climate change in the world.
That is really interesting. I do fancy myself an urban farmer, if I may say so myself, self-taught. But it seems as if I need a little bit more guidance in terms of what the opportunities would be. So I'm probably too old to enroll now for a degree. But if we then consider, for example, all of these opportunities, even the threats that we have, how do you think the faculty specifically addresses these opportunities, and how do you prepare students within agriculture for the future? Because, I mean, we're talking about a climate smart agriculture or management of that, digitalization. We have spoken about the value chain, the value agricultural chain, the value of that. And then also, Cheryl, you mentioned indigenous knowledge as well, which I think we, especially in our context, we can't just throw out of the window with, the baby in the bathwater, that type of scenario. So from your point of view, how do we then prepare our students for this and a climate that we don't know what's going to happen,
Appreciating complexity and appreciating contextual knowledge is really important for addressing those, and appreciating the role that our traditional knowledge plays in the system is very important. The faculty has been introducing transdisciplinary research programs, which I believe are critically important for particularly bringing postgraduate students into a system that deals with solution-driven research that seeks to make an impact on society, on the lives of everyday people. And so there are a number of these initiatives that are that have already begun and that are being planned for the future. But let me give you some practical examples from my own department. So through conversations with stakeholders, the future employers of our graduates in agricultural economics, and also with our students themselves, the students in our first year had a very interesting conversation with us. Many come from farming backgrounds, but their parents have sent them to study agricultural economics because the parents say they can teach them about the production side of agriculture, but they are short of the skills on the business side. So the future will require more business skills. And in my research, I've heard this echoed on the ground by smallholders who say, we know how to farm, we don't know about the business side of farming. And so we've introduced specific Excel skills for assessing profitability and for farm planning that give the students a hands-on experience of how you would, for example, plan a dairy herd. How many animals do you need? How many times do they have to be replaced? What is the potential? Is it going to be profitable or not? So unfortunately, these stop at the Excel experience, but in future we plan to extend that through some of our stakeholder partnerships to be able to show them these things on the ground. So this is very important for the real world and for students to gain from the personal immersion of doing such a project. At the postgraduate level, I think this contextual knowledge becomes even more important. And postgrad students in our department have big picture exposure. So it's not just about what the knowledge you need for your dissertation or thesis, but understanding the trade-offs that are involved in decisions at the farm level or at the environment level or through policy making in order for them to understand how you go about meeting the multiple objectives of the SDGs. So our students are exposed to critiques of African case studies, of reports on African agriculture and food systems. So in this way, they gain examples of innovation in agricultural practices and marketing, trade, and also, very importantly, how to evaluate what policy options are possible to address these solutions.
I think that contextual is also very important, because what we find, I mean, I have never seen a yam in South Africa, but I've seen a yam in Ghana, for example. You know, apples are not as freely available in Kenya. You know, it's something which I didn't know. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and I really like the whole solution-driven research, you know, and that we need, and this goes for all disciplines, we need to follow an interdisciplinary approach. That's the way to go, I think. JB, what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with what Cheryl said there. And similarly, allow me to shamelessly market my department.
Please do.
Over here. So in consumer and food sciences, we most of our students end up working in the food industry. But it's not restricted to the food industry. They work in other areas as well. But what we try and get to our students is to make them aware of these trends that we have. One of the trends which we didn't mention, which I think Ayanda alluded to, is we have a nutrition transition taking place. And that has been as a result of the rapid urbanization, which is affecting people's food choices and so on and so forth. And that nutrition transition is leading to increases in the occurrence of non-communicable diseases. So in our honors, BSc Food Science honors, and nutrition as well, in our honors course, we have a module Advanced Food Science and Nutrition, in which I think for the past couple of years, we have modeled that on a theme. So we chose the theme Nutrition Transition. And then we look at all the issues related to nutrition transition. What are the causes? What are the effects? What can a food scientist or a nutritionist do to try and address these problems? So that's one way in which we try and prepare our students for these challenges. Indigenous knowledge is also quite important. And we are looking to actually introduce a module on traditional African foods, indigenous foods, their importance, how they are made, nutritional quality, and all of that to prepare our students. And then for my department in particular, consumer and food science, if you look at the food value chain, the consumer is a very, very important part of that food value chain. So having consumer and food science together creates opportunities for us to create some synergies in the way we train our students in preparing them for the workplace, so that they go out of there more rounded food scientist or nutritionist who is in a position to try and address some of the problems that we have. So that's, in a nutshell, how we try and train our students to meet those challenges.
Thank you. So off farming, so this is for my own clarity, would then include, for example, the nutritionists.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's part of the whole chain. Yeah.
Yes.
Because the food has to be nutritious.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And taste good as well.
And taste good as well. And then be a little bit affordable, I would think.
That's right. Yeah.
Ayanda, linking you in. So so you're not a staff member, but you're a very important stakeholder in this process. So what do you think would be, for example, the type of skills that these students coming from the faculty should have?
So I'm still going to focus specifically on the value chain of agriculture.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So to add on to what Cheryl said, that to run a farm, for example, is a business at the end of the day. And there are other supporting items or activities that form part of that. And one of it would be, let's say that's more like you're off farm, and that is your insurance industry. How does the insurance industry fall into that value chain as a support? How does the banking industry form part of that as support to provide the capital? What is needed? What business, for example, devising of business plan, that comes to the business approach of training our students and exposing them to all these opportunities that are available, specifically focusing right now on the insurance industry for agriculture as well. So I think that is also another focus area that we need to look at, the supporting the supporting activities in the value chain, not the main aspect, but the ones that support to ensure that the value chain in the agricultural sector is still moving.
Yes.
And sustainable as well.
So I think that whole sustainability, which goes back to the Sustainable Development Goals, which Cheryl also referred to. Now, Ayanda, so a question from our panel members. And I this is also, a question that I have. So Caroline is asking, how does GMO not secure any food shortages that we might have in the future? If yes, will there be any health implications associated with genetically modified foods? And I kind of think, Cheryl, this is right up your alley, isn't it?
Yes, I was hoping you weren't going to bat it my way. I have to answer it cautiously. So yes, GMOs have made a huge difference in terms of bumping up the productivity of agriculture. And they do allow particularly drought tolerance varieties in order to address some of the climate change challenges that we have. We're not entirely sure about the nutritional implications, the long-term components. Very often it's not the GMO itself, but the indiscriminate use of pesticides and herbicides that is more dangerous on a GMO. So yeah, it's a fine line to work, but definitely biotechnology has many solutions that can address not just crop production, but human health, animal health. We can see it in the current crisis with a zoonosis like COVID, that technology can rapidly respond in order to manage some of the threats to the availability of food. Yeah, but in Africa, biotechnology is viewed with a great deal of suspicion. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And how to apply that in a sensitive way.
Absolutely. Daniel is also referring to the sustainability question and the whole value chain's ability to measure, report, and manage. And I think, Ayanda, that is also what both of you are referring to in terms of that support, the additional support. And the additional support will create more opportunities for us. Now, Ayanda, you spoke about urbanization and the growing populations, and this is a question that is asking, how do we then balance, so in terms of opinions, and I'm just throwing it at you, in terms of feeding our fellow Africans versus sending food to other nations? Is there a balance that we can acquire? How do we balance that? Difficult, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm also going to ask my other panel members to assist in that question and answering that question as well. But what I'm thinking about is that there is a very thin line when it comes to us exporting food to different nations outside our continent. At the same time, we should not do it at a point where it's causing our natural resources to deplete and leads to starvation of our own people. So I think there should be a good balance between us providing food security for our nation, but at the same time not replenishing our natural resources that makes our African continent unique.
Yes.
And that makes us attractive to the world as well. So it shouldn't be an 80, just an example, an 80% of our food production is, let's say, for example, exported in Europe, for example, yet in South Africa, we have a scarcity of a particular natural resource, but we're busy exporting it. We should aim at providing natural resources that are sustainable in the long run, but also at the same time catering for our local citizens, our local African people, to ensure that our nation is fed before we start feeding the world.
Okay.
Yes.
So almost like charity begins at home.
Yes, charity, that's the aim thing. Charity does begin at home. Yes.
JB?
No,
Cheryl?
absolutely. I agree. I mean, it's about getting that balance right, because exports will always be important. There may be opportunities where the products that you are exporting are quite unique in terms of the fact that maybe you are the only one who can provide that. And then also gives opportunities for earning foreign exchange, which is good for the economy. So it's about, weighing the two. Do not let your own people go hungry. Make sure your own people are fed, and try and find that sweet spot. It may not be easy to find, but one has to try and get to that perfect balance between the two in terms of how much you export or what you export, and then what you leave for your own people. So yes, it's quite important.
Thank you. Cheryl, word from you.
Yeah, I think we need to look at imports more than exports. So as JB says, exports generate income for government and for farmers. And very often the kind of crop that we're exporting doesn't have huge domestic demand. But on the other hand, the shocking realities of how much Africa relies on the Ukraine and Russia for our staple foods is something we really have to wake up to. And many governments have shifted away from self-sufficiency in production, not that I'm promoting complete self-sufficiency, but we need to look within the African region as to how we can move food in ways that benefit African farmers. But the consumption trends come into this as well, because the commodity we're going to be short of is bread quality wheat. And it's not likely we're going to find that 30% gap that we have from our imports for the immediate future. And so our reliance on bread, which doesn't require energy, which is also getting more expensive, is something we need to think very carefully about. So while convenience foods like bread have many benefits for very busy middle class and lower end consumers, our reliance on having to import that much grain from Australia or from the Ukraine is really exposing the lack of resilience in our own system and the lack of balance. So while we might have enough food in the country, we are going to have to change consumption patterns to cope in the near future. And that has psychological impacts for many South Africans, people who remember only being able to buy yellow maize in the 1970s, the 1980s food crisis, and having to change to soy, for example, to meet protein needs. So, yeah, there are many factors to be considered, but I would think import reliance is more important to consider.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think, so I myself am a bread lover, so not loving what you are saying, but this just refocus us then on the importance of urban farming. So obviously I cannot go and plant grain in my garden. I could, but it's probably not going to be successful. And if we also look at a comment made by Nigel, it's not so simple as just putting seed in the ground and then watering. and hydro aeroponics that you refer to, Ayanda, also, it's very high tech. People don't always understand it, getting that temperature right. So he's also saying, that small gardens could be the way to go. I have seen the whole movement in terms of less grass, more vegetables. I grow from my own little, tomatoes, chilies, baby marrows, and so forth. And then also we have a UP community engagement garden, Mujaji Gabedi, which is really a fine example that we can use. And Nigel, thank you for reminding us of that. Now, one of the challenges that we also have is that sharing of information between the industry, the institutions, and the farmers. And that is a bridge that we also need to gap or to cross, not to gap, to cross. So the question Stefan is posing is, how do we close that gap, and how do we ensure that no farmers are left behind, especially in terms of our smaller farmers, your substance farmers? How do we do that? What would you suggest?
I would think this is where, as Cheryl mentioned, the transdisciplinary approach becomes quite important.
Yes.
Because the transdisciplinary approach, you're not restricting yourself to your own discipline. You need the skills in other disciplines which address some of these other things that Stefan is talking about. So I would think that having that transdisciplinary approach in mind whilst training the students equips the students much better in meeting these challenges that we have, because we have a very, very broad value chain as we know it. And there are various parts in the value chain which need different types of skills. So relying on that transdisciplinary approach, I think, is quite important in that regard.
Thank you. JB, there's a question from Paulette, and she asks, is there an alternative to wheat as staple? It's kind of, what would be the alternative? And please don't tell me kale is the alternative to lettuce.
All right. Okay. So one of the big problems with wheat is the fact that we have a problem where a lot of people are allergic to gluten, which is
lots of people.
Allergic to gluten. So there are people who have to rely on a gluten-free diet. And definitely we've been doing research where we're looking at using other crops or other cereals to try and make bread. It doesn't become like the bread from wheat. But we like to think about those types of breads more like specialty breads. And for instance, if you use maize or sorghum to make bread, you rather call it a flat bread rather than the bread that which will rise very, very nicely. So yes, the opportunities to look at other cereals, other types of grains that one can use to make bread, which will be gluten-free, and therefore would address this problem of people that are allergic to gluten. But to get one particular type of grain that will behave exactly like wheat, I don't think you will get that. But rather use other types of grain to make and market it as specialty breads. Like, for instance, you can have rye bread, the same thing with breads from other grains as well. So yes. And then also spoke about wheat, which brings to mind another example. I don't like talking about beer, but let me use that example because it illustrates this so well. Barley has been the grain of choice in making beer. And now, some years back, importation of barley became very, very expensive. I think this started off in Nigeria. It became very, very expensive to import barley to make bread. So what they did was they decided to ban the importation of barley. And so this forced the scientists to go and look at other grains that could be used to make lager beer. And today, lager beer can be made from sorghum. And it's not only in Nigeria, but in other countries as well. So yes, it's possible to use other grains and not rely on the normally used grains for things like bread and beer and so on and so forth.
I just can't help to think that obviously these specialized breads are more expensive. You know, even rye bread would be more expensive than normal bread, you know. So let's hear from the agricultural economist. How do we, within the whole, you know, so yes, we have the agricultural value chain, but then we also have that supply chain. What can we do possibly? And I'm putting all of you on the spot. I'm fully aware of that.
So for the last 4 decades, we agricultural economists have driven the narrative of cheap food for the masses. And that has driven agricultural research and development into 5 major staple crops. And it has driven down the prices of those foods because the greater the demand and the greater the supply, the cheaper the food is. So as the demand rises, so it will shift the economics of production and supply of food. And so if we on wholesale start to change our consumption patterns, we will drive responses from the agricultural sector and particularly from the research and development sector. So crops like sorghum and millets are completely neglected and haven't seen the investment from science, from biotechnology, from even the food sector. But slowly you're seeing these products coming on the shelf, like sampan beans and tins by Koo. There are lots of products that are now, and the different flavors of tomato and onion that serve cultural diets. There's clearly demand for that. There's demand for the cheaper beer that JB's speaking of as well. So in fact, maize-based beer, although I'm not a drinker, is cheaper and is the product of choice for people who are trying to save money. So yeah, we really do drive the response from the sector by what we demand as consumers. So being more mindful consumers will help us. And so that's where departments like JB's are very important, because the consumer messages that we are giving to people need to celebrate our African culture and heritage and prize those as foods. We need Jamie Oliver kind of people in Africa who will rise up and say, this stuff is good for you. Popeye the Sailor Man is a brilliant example. He was created in the 1930s by the British TV Corporation, and Popeye led to a 35% change in the consumption of vegetables over a 5-year period. So marketing is powerful, and the messaging and what we celebrate is powerful. But unfortunately, many young people in South Africa and Africa aspire for an American diet, which is terrible for our health. And we should be finding ways of developing those tastes, because they are a little different, and celebrating the diversity and the cultures that we have.
It's because I said kale, isn't it?
And I also think, I mean, one of the ways of doing that is when training our students, we want to train them in such a way that they go out there to be ambassadors or champions of these so-called underutilized grains and traditional foods and so on and so forth. Instill some pride in them about these, which are actually quite good and healthy for us as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Then bringing it together, you know, if we look, for example, at Brian's comment where he said, and this links to the value chain, Ayanda, that you spoke about, it might be useful for us to consider value networks, the value pathway. How do we do that? And you can see also that there are questions now coming in hot and fast in terms of greenhouses. How can we improve food security? The impact will it have, if every household in South Africa has a greenhouse to grow any favorable crop, can that be considered to have a negative impact on farmers and the country's economy? And then what can we do better? Sanushka's asking, what can we do better to capacitate the small growers in terms of climate smart agriculture and knowledge of newer technologies? And then Caroline is asking, and stop us from worrying about consuming processed foods. So this ties in nicely with my last question to the panel in terms of how do we then truly bridge this gap between the current realities that we are facing today, and then also the world of agriculture in the future? You know, so how do we address this? So as Nadine has said, well said, if product development acknowledge the consumer or follow a consumer-centric approach, the demand will match the supply and will result in reasonable prices. So my esteemed panel guests, bring it all together. Bring us those beautiful solutions.
Shall I start?
Ayanda, there you go.
Thank you so much. So just to conclude, at the end of the day, it's all about access to information. Access to information about our small farmers, about the food industry, about the challenges so that we can use these challenges for opportunities. With the current realities that we are facing right now, there are certain areas that will always be affected in the entire value chain, whether we are in today or in the future. And I'll just break them down into, it's about 5 of them that I'll just mention now, or let me mention the 6 as well, is about land and accessibility of land and how land is used. Mm-hmm. Today and in the future, it will always be a hot topic. Then another thing that we also need to look at is the state of economics and trade as well in the country, globally, and the trends thereof, where we are today and where we're going in the future. Availability and access to natural resources today and in the future. Skills, labor, developing the skills. Are we providing skills right now that will be irrelevant in the next 10 years? Mm-hmm. Or are we developing skills now in the agricultural sector or in the agricultural value chain that will still be effective not only in the next 50 years, but for the next generation, and will leave a legacy behind in the next generation, and adaptable as well in the next generation? When it comes to another aspect that I also want to point out is also the climate change, which is disaster management as well. How do we manage your drought? How do we manage these unpredictable temperatures and seasons and the things that are impacting it? Pollution, waste. What are we doing with waste? How do we incorporate the waste that we have now and use it as a sustainable and an indigenous and a unique feature for the African continent, for South Africa, that makes us stand out in the value chain as well? So it's a whole lot of, it's an entire basket that we need to use these challenges that we are facing today as opportunities to empower our position in the global sphere as we move forward in the future as well as specifically for future employment for our students today.
Yes. I also noticed that as part of the discussions from our audience, somebody actually also referred to pollution, but then also the next comment considered, for example, how can we recycle? Yes. So bringing that also into the mix, you know. So what do we do with the food scraps? Because we can recycle them, you know, they become compost. So little things like that where we can bring changes about.
No, absolutely. I mean, waste reutilization is a big area of research in my department as well, because during food processing, lots of waste is generated. And the thing is, there are still some really, really good things in this so-called waste. So waste reutilization is a big aspect of the research we do. But in bringing everything together, I would like to bring it down to how we train our students. I believe strongly in the fact that we should train our students to be acutely aware of these trends. The trends we have now and the trends we don't know of that are coming. And then how to develop agility in responding to them. I think that would be very, very important. And to be able to do that, I'll go back to that transdisciplinary approach as well. I think we should give our students a much broader base of knowledge and training. So, for instance, can we give our consumer and food science students some skills in entrepreneurship and business? Can we give students in other disciplines some training which gives them information about food science and consumer science? Talking about precision agriculture, for instance, where things like GPS technology and so on are quite important, takes me back to the Department of Geography and Geoinformatics. Can we give a food science student some skills in that regard? So that broad base of skills, I believe, will be quite important in putting our students in a very, very strategic position and place them in important positions within the value chain to try and address the problems that we're facing now and the problems that are coming ahead.
Yes, that is great. Cheryl.
I would totally echo that, JB. And Natasha, and your faculty or students in their first or second year have to do a module in philosophy. And we need something like that. So all students in the natural and agricultural sciences faculty have to do the basic sciences in first year. But we forget about this contextual and the big picture knowledge. So maybe it's time we introduce something that can introduce crop scientists to animal production and where the fodder and comes from. Food science students to the constraints to increasing the supply of food in response to demand. There's so many different ways, apart from the big C's and the 4 F's that I mentioned earlier. I think we need to expose students to that. But personally, I think we need to find ways of creating students with more savvy, both as entrepreneurs and as future employees. And this is savvy in the technology, the business, the environment, and also the energy sector, so that they're able to communicate as a team and to solve problems in a more holistic way, which is the real world context in which we're living. And the future world is going to be even more integrated and complex than what we know now. And so I think we need to find ways of providing students with immersions in experiential opportunities to discover the real world, rather than just to be taught about the real world, so that they are able to learn how to do more and think about how to do more with less, more smartly in future. And this includes the soft skills. So it's not just the hard skills, but the soft skills, communication, coordination, leadership, teamwork, for example. So finding a way in which we can connect the knowledge in our head, so the head knowledge, our heart, which is our passion and compassion, the tacit knowledge of this experiential component, and practical applications, I think would really prepare our students for the future and provide them with that agility and adaptability to cope with what comes in the future.
True words have not been spoken in a while, if you ask me. If we consider the future of work, we need to consider whether or not, for example, our students are employable, but also this ability to be self-employers so that they can employ themselves. And our students will eventually also become the employer. And we need to properly prepare them for that future that is an unknown. But we do look at trends. We do consider trends. And especially within the future, the Center of the Future of Work, we are following absolutely a multi-intradisciplinary approach, because we believe that that is what the future should look like, where students have exposure to the various sciences. And that includes also then the soft skills. You know, if we talk 21st century skills or the future of work skills, there are particular skills, that savviness, that creative thinking, critical thinking as well. But ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to end this session, and I would like to thank our panel members specifically for their very valuable insights. Professor JB Duru, thank you. Ms. Ayanda Ntangasi, thank you. Professor Cheryl Hendricks, we thank you as well. Professor Barend Erasmus on the side, as well as my own Dean, Professor Margaret Titika Mabugu. Thank you to the audience for your active participation, and we hope to see you soon at another conversation series. Goodbye from all of us, and thank you.